I feel myself to be a sort of a kamikaze, because I will be speaking about problems that you often come across with, and to me, this is something that I am an external observer of. And I have to say outright that for this role of kamikaze, as I was saying, for me to choose it, there were two reasons. First, I evaluate highly and I value highly what the school does, as much as I value the experts and the people who come to the school and give their presentations. For the past 3 and 4 years, I really have a high degree of trust to what the school does. The second reason is more common, is that I'm completing a book on the historical memory in 6 countries, and one of the chapters will be dedicated to Russia. And I have not finished the book yet, and the reason why I have chosen this topic is that I would like to indeed test some of my hypotheses and proposals with respect to Russia, judging by your reactions to my presentation. I would like to start my presentation with some theoretical propositions. When we speak about cultural history and historical memory, these are often treated as synonyms. The fact is that we deal with two phenomena which still need to be distinguished. The culture of memory, or the totality of different historical narratives which allow the society to try and understand this present that surrounds us. It plays an important role for mobilization, which is important for the government and is an important part of the national identity. The culture of identity may be made of several narratives from different epochs. This could be mythology. This is a category which we always see in cultural history, and one may often come across a theory about two categories of such myths: the fundamental myth and the nourishing myth. What I have just said relates to the culture of memory, and the historical politics or politics of memory is something different. It's a less sophisticated notion compared to the culture of memory. It has it pursues the purpose of developing the new narratives, so the historical memory, politics or politics of history only encompasses several domains of this memory. And the things that I discuss are not particularly related to the history itself, but to the contemporary politics. And I would very much like to ask you to compare in your mind with the previous presentation by Mikhail Fishman, and you will see some coincidences, even chronologically, because the strengthening of the authoritarian regime is also related to the changes in culture and the historical policies or politics of history. So how does it look on the example of Russia? Elena has already said that when we speak of Russia, we deal with a somewhat special country. We can only find theoretical analogues as in Belarus and the Ukraine. But even here, we have some distinction, considerable distinction. Belarus, unless we take into account the Soviet narratives, Belarus acquired some new lines of memory only in the past several decades. And after 2014, we can see in the Ukraine how far the Ukraine is moving away from the so-called Russian model of treating one's past. When I say these things, I'm just stipulating a fact. And what I'm saying is that what we see in the Ukraine I'm only stipulating the fact itself. The general things for all these countries which are treated in the 6 chapters of my book is that all of these have not been able to quite overcome the Soviet past, even though such attempts have been taken. If we pass on to Russia, one may say that the sources of this culture of memory, or rather its absence, these sources are in the Soviet past. And so it is quite interesting to see what has happened in today's Russia with the previous Soviet myths, how they have evolved, what occurred to these. If we take the Soviet Union, then the main Soviet myths, which were in the basis of the culture of memory, we can single out 3 main is the myth of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. And let me say that I'm using this term myth as a theoretical theoretical term. This has nothing to do with the interpretation of the word myth as something false. I'm not trying to make a synonym of myth and falsity. I'm rather trying to apply the word myth as rather a narrative replete with different details and lines of thought. Now, what occurred to the myths in Soviet myth? The myth of progress, the myth of the October Revolution, and the myth of the victory. So the myth of progress was the first to sink. The breakup of the Soviet Union, the default, have shown that one can't be talking about the economic progress and the economic achievements. But if we try to finish this topic, one may say that some elements of this myth of progress have remained in Russia. Let us say when we speak about the Russian space or cosmonaut narrative. Now, this is interesting because such a myth, the myth of progress, is not particularly frequent in history, in societies far and wide. And I can remember an analogy in Germany after 1945, which was related to the so-called German economic miracle. And after World War II, the shadow of the Holocaust and the German guilt were the negative part of the memory, and there had to be some compensation. So this myth of progress, the myth of economic miracle, was what the Germans proposed to this guilt complex. Now, the myth of progress in the Soviet Union was also a kind of compensation for the devastation and indeed the annihilation of the historical Russia. And this could have been compensated with the narrative of the bright future, the astounding progress that the Soviet Union was to make. But what happened to the other myths? The progress myth was soon to die, but how about the others? I may say that when we treat the period from perestroika until today, then we are encountering in both cases with the process of their deconstruction and an attempt for these to revive these. And we may say that Russia is anything but that today's Russia is some sort of a citadel of communism. It isn't. Or we can hardly say that the idea of communism in today's Russia have died. No, that we can't either say. We can't say that either. But the myth about the October Revolution, it is still alive. But as I've already said, during perestroika, the first attempts were made to deconstruct this myth, which is partially due to the changing interpretation of the activities of Vladimir Ulyanov, Lenin as the central figure of the October Revolution. And this deconstruction was, of course, borrowed from and this was done in part by the prominent Russian authors, including Selyunin. At the end of the 1980s, this reconsidering of the role of Vladimir Ulyanov was also repeated by Yakovlev and other perestroika figures. Yakovlev was often very critical of Lenin's revolution and his policies of creating the Soviet Union as a genocidal state. We know that up until the end of the Soviet history, I can't say if Gorbachev believed or had faith in the ideas of Leninism. I simply can't comment on it. But at least in rhetoric, in his public addresses, he was certainly a supporter of Leninism. And Russia's departure from the Leninism and from the myth of the October Revolution was already a fact of the independent Russia, of the post-Soviet Russia. And here, definitely a great role was played by the putsch of the coup attempt of 1991 and the struggle of Boris Yeltsin against the communists, which indeed was instrumental in deconstructing the myth of the October Revolution. In 1994, this state holiday, which was celebrated in November as the Day of the October Revolution, was renamed into the Day of Reconciliation and Harmony, which of course never materialized. So the name is there, but I don't think that it has ever led to the civil consensus in Russia. And eventually Vladimir Putin introduced a new holiday, which was the Day of the National Solidarity, related to the 17th century events. And this was more of a fictitious holiday, and we know that the Russian nationalists are often seeing this as a holiday of the Russian nationalism. But alongside with that, we are seeing also in the communist camp and in the among the intellectuals and what we can see that in 2005 the revolution started to be called just October Revolution, not the Great October Revolution. These new interpretations led to just the Soviet time started to be viewed as just another period in the life of the Russian nation, and such views generally support the attempts to build in the Soviet history as a apparently normal part of the evolution of Russia, and the October Revolution was no longer seen as a dismantlement of the Russian society, but as a manifestation of the so-called Russian spirit. Now, this myth has not been quite overcome. Just an episode I would like to quote. I can't say when was it exactly, but the railways of Russia, the railway company of Russia, is that there will be no longer a Leningradsky railway station. It will be renamed into Nikolaevsky railway station, but after this official announcement of the renaming, nothing was ever done. This just shows that Russia still has quite a multitude of supporters of these Soviet myths. However, when and if we say that this myth still plays an important role, it is not possible to compare it with the third the fundamental myth of today's Russian history, which is the victory in the Second World War. And here, when we look at the different festivities related to the Victory Day, one may see that this may have always been the case, and that this Victory Day, the V-Day, has always been such a grand fete in the Russian or the Soviet history. However, I would like to specifically draw your attention to the substantial changes which have occurred to this day and to the way it is celebrated, and that serious attempts at deconstructing this myth have also taken place.
That dates back to the perestroika, when the Supreme Soviet, back in 1988, acknowledged that secret addenda to Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were signed in their time, that really demonstrated that the Soviet Union not only fell victim to the German fascist aggression, but also was one of the culprits, as the speaker says, that the Second World War started, and that in that war, the Soviet Union had to not only liberate other countries from fascism, but also the Soviet Union, the country, had its own very specific territorial stakes in the deal with Hitler. First and foremost, in Western literature, they also highlight the importance of debate. On Suvorov's book, The Icebreaker, you may have heard something about this book too. And this is the purpose of the book, which as many historians, professional historians, not only in Russia but in the West too, think it is a very unprofessional. And the facts that are presented there as facts really need to be properly verified. So this book that cannot be attributed as anything good, but it really seriously influenced the contents of the myth of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. And all this seeks to confirm all this in very specific acts of the Russian leadership. Back in 1996, a law was adopted at the start of the Great Patriotic War, called it the Day of Memory and Grief. And this is the first time during the Soviet and post-Soviet times that, for a pretty brief time, Russia, in its center of interpretation of the myth, as the speaker calls it, of the victory in the Second World War, another accent was put in place that didn't put so much focus on the victory as grief, mourning of human loss of lives, of all losses. And in Yeltsin's time, for a while, the center of that myth, of this narrative about the Great Patriotic War, it was all about humans, about each specific fate of each individual, but it was not the focus on the state or the power. But I would also agree with my colleagues who very clearly designate that the myth nowadays, in today's Russia, is playing such a grand role in modern Russia that former President Yeltsin was highly instrumental here. It was he who, back in 1995, resumed the celebration of the Victory Day. Also in 1995, for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow saw a resumption of military parade It's also interesting. But what I find even more interesting, actually, is how the interpretation of the very myth took place and how here novel accents are shifted in his interpretation, which actually show very well in which area the thinking of political elites in Russia, where it is going to. Now, do let's go back to 1995. I would like to draw your attention here to some matters which were focused as that celebration took place at that time. And what were the meanings attributed to that? First of all, again, this integration of the Russian society. The victory was perceived as the link between Russia and the West. That feast was presented as generally a very important historic argument to explain why Russia should be a pro-Western state. But at the same time, we could see that it was exactly then that nationalization of that holiday took place, and the Victory Day turned from being a Soviet victory of the Soviet people over fascism, turns into a day of victory of Russian, ethnic Russian, as the speaker says, русского, not российского народа in the victory. We see this in 2005 and 2009, and this is where we see that attempts to rehabilitate the Soviet history. And in that interpretation, first and foremost, the focus was to make sure that Russia was very much like Western countries. Russia and the West share same values. Back in 2005, that was claimed. But later on, the accents, the shifts were on the standoff between Russia and the West. That the victory, Russians had to, this is where the speaker says Россияне, means not ethnic Russians, but all dwellers of Russia, that the West betrayed Russia and the Soviet Union by opening the Second Front left. And it is important that in 2004 and 2005 we can see that Russia starts for the first time to pursue very active historic policy. And the focus of this policy is exactly this topic of victory in the Great Patriotic War. We can also see that the government searches for opportunity to remind the West more and more often about that victory. And they adopt new holidays, the Day of Hero of a country. And this is exactly when the historic event turned into a myth. And some even say attempts were made to take a different perspective on that. What is followed is that one has to already, I beg your pardon, the interpreter didn't understand the word. Was it punitive, карательный, or some other? I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Now a couple of words. Some measures have to be taken, but which are they? Sorry. Now we must speak about Russia's historic policy on its history after 2005, and some special features of that policy on history. Let us begin with the reasons. Why is it that it is 2005 was the turning point? What was important about this? And we cannot do without considering the economic aspect. We know that Putin's rule coincided with the economic boom in Russia in early days. That Russia pretty rapidly paid out the public debt, and the first years of Putin's rule were related with economic growth and the growth of living standards, and people of Russia, for the first time in this free Russia time, did not have to think only about how to support their families, how to make both ends meet till the next salary day comes, and could only enjoy the success, economic progress. That was one of the reasons. But the other reason had to do with strengthening authoritarian government. Authoritarian regime in Russia required, so to say, moral guarantees, or so to say, strengthening of power. It had to look back on the past, and this focus, first and foremost, of the state, and only after that the society, was made by spreading more and more the myth about the victory in the Second World War. That was also related to symbolic recognition of Russia as a great power. Russia, I'm again repeating the words by some Russian experts, Russia had the right, was entitled to being considered as a very important and big country, but symbolic resources in, for example, the history of the victory in the Second World War were not available, and that is why, in order to strengthen the perception of Russia as the great power, the political elites went back to that topic. Surely that meant recognition of Russia as the great state, and as they organized these important feasts dedicated to the Great Patriotic War, they would invite all state actors, figures, statesmen from important Western countries, and the indirect reason for strengthening of Russia's historic policy was the conflict with Lithuania and Estonia, because their presidents refused to attend the Victory Day in the Second World War, in the Great Patriotic War in 2005. I don't know whether I can trust the words by some Russian experts who claim that because these two presidents refused to come, Putin took it as a personal, speaker says, victory or insult. Sorry, didn't hear that. This is an indirect reason, and I just quoted it because politicians don't necessarily. We can find some regularity, and some random conflicts may also play a very important role later on. If you look at special features of the Russian historic policy, which is being pursued right now, one must say that we should look at how it is pursued, even without thinking what is in its essence. We may say that this was a successful project. It involved many diverse actors that competed between one another, and that competed for grants, and I would just put several of these actors that just implemented the historic policy in Russia, as Regnum, as the Foundation for Historic Memory, the Historic Perspective Foundation. But we may say that the actors in that historic memory were basically all television, and in principle what we call today the victory, where Russia has great successes here, they may also be related to the activation of historic policy on history. And these actors later on were very actively used in not only in Russia but in other countries too. And the other special feature of the Russian historic policy on history is that the historic memory should be encompass not only the territory of Russia but also beyond it. The main topic. And this is where we can identify 7 topics. First of all, the victory in the Great Patriotic War. But this is the Soviet heritage. The Soviet heritage is also an important part of today's policy on history in Russia. What is also very important is a myth of brotherly Slavonic peoples. We remember at the times of presidency of President Yushchenko was in government in Ukraine. The wars that had to do with Cossack rebellions, with betrayal in Poltava, and when the Ukrainian Cossacks took over the Swedish side against the Russian emperor. So these battles, historic battles, were waged back then, and the Russian historic memory now enjoys the idea of pan-Slavism that is playing such an important role towards Serbia, but again towards Ukraine and Belarus too. And in brief, immediately after, when the policy on history was reactivated in Russia, it was first and foremost directed at the domestic market. And this is where the first who saw the changing this in Russia were exactly school education and first and foremost textbooks, history textbooks. Say before 2000, Russia in this regard was pretty liberal country, and as my data show, sometime till 2006, out of only one textbook that the commission that adopts and endorses textbooks so that they could be used in schools, only one out of all suggested was refused. But since then, many of them would be denied the status of endorsed by the Ministry of Enlightenment and Education. That gave rise to the idea to create for all Russian books in the Russian Federation one and only textbook. And this is where, and this textbook is not available yet. And the very most recent attempts to create this textbook failed. And that, for that matter, the ones responsible for it, it's not that the regime hasn't got the resources to do it. No. Russia is too great a country, and Russia is inhabited by too many different nations who, parallel to the Russian, ethnic Russian memory of culture, have their own memories. And the reluctance to open new fronts is that we will never live to see one single textbook on history. As we speak about the textbook, one should say that several very important reforms were carried out. First and second, in 2002, they adopted practical assignments where the school children were recommended to interview their grandfathers about Second World War, probably great-grandfathers. There's minor changes in the approaches towards studying history in Russia made that the memory of the Great Patriotic War was revived in the third or fourth generation since then. And that generation started to reestablish the link, the ties with the traditions of the family. And this is also very important, and I would put this way, a very successful step of today's Russia's leadership. I also kept saying that actually right here, what came on board was the top government, top leaders in Russia. I would like to recall here the commission under President Medvedev against falsifying Russian history. That lasted for a short while, 2009-2012, and in theory did not do much, but what it did a lot to just a few rose to write textbooks against the adopted canon, and all kinds of recommendations by this commission came into play, all kinds of guidance they published. It just created a difficult climate against all topics related to the past. And 2014, where the legislation sort of foresaw concrete measures, envisaged concrete measures, means punishment, legal punishment, legal persecution for falsifying history. And as you know, they're pretty tough. The goal of all the changes, and I'm recalled it in short, is to accumulate symbolic capital, defending the image of Russia as a superpower. And in this sense, in this chief historic myth, the center is not focused on the victory per se, but it is rather the state, the great power of Russia. Russia is the great power, and this topic is used only to focus on that aspect alone. The main topic to be used in global politics of the Russian Empire and orthodoxy, and here the focus is mostly made on the orthodoxy, Orthodox Christianity, the ideas of pan-Slavism, a brotherhood of Slavonic nations. One should say that for Russia and for the Russian leadership, a very important question was the genesis of the state, of the Russian state. Which date can we consider to be the birth of that power? And now that Ukraine became an independent state, that made it somewhat difficult. And we can see that the place of Kiev, instead they would try to find novel places, that the birthplace of the Russian state, like Greater Novgorod, 2001, Staraya Ladога, 2003. For the short time it just replaced the symbolic place of Kiev. The last attempt to identify the place that gave rise to the great power of Russia was, of course, Crimea, 2015. Surely all these stories could be discussed in giving quite interesting and stories, almost detective stories, of how the president conducted conversation with historians and so on, who again stood in the way of changing the focus on other historic times. But regrettably, we are short of time and we cannot do it right now. And now, finally, what are the alternatives to the dominating narratives? And the alternatives, in general, in today's historic policy of Russia. And this is where we should probably raise the question of what is it that the political elites of Russia want? What do they want of the past? Or probably there are some things they don't want. They don't know it, what they want. That's why we see these doubts. Well, I gave you this date, 2009. Putin admits that Stalinism committed crimes and recognizes the blame that Katyn tragedy was the fault, and the blame was laid on Stalin and Stalin's regime. That happened in Gdańsk. But the chief alternative for the whatever initiatives come from the acting regime in today's Russia, I see a memorial in the question of their memorial, sorry, as an organization, their memorial that society, man, personality is more important than the state. This is probably an eternal problem. What is more important? Is it man or is it the state? And even here, it shows a possible alternative that Russia might also move there too. And that all this is not just like my own utopia. The program that was adopted by Russia, dedicated to the victims of Stalinism in 2011-2013, and in the same, again, resumed Museum of Gulag, in my view, it looks a bit indecent, I would put it this way. And even you look at this museum as just a collection of historic facts, because many interpretations are surprising there. And finally, and the specific features of historic memory. This is where we should immediately highlight that this specific features designate the authoritarian approach that we see now in Russia. It is a top-down approach, almost without involving the society. Russia is the only post-communist country that, as it constructs historic memory, didn't go back to normalcy, that is pre-Soviet time, and so on and so forth. You can read it in this slide. Excuse me, I spoke at length, just for one reason, so that you should get some less time to criticize me. Thank you so much.